All right, welcome back. So we're going to talk about microbial lifestyles in water in this particular pre-lecture, and we're primarily focused on the differences between primary production and secondary production. Let's make sure we understand that. So when we talk about primary production, right, what we're talking about is producing carbon from organisms that fix carbon from the atmosphere. So in the ocean, it's estimated that about 50 to 60 petagrams, of carbon are produced per year. So the ocean is about 50% of the total primary production in the year, right? So we're talking about carbon when we talk about production. And a petagram, if you don't know what that is 10 to the 15th grams. That's a lot, right? That's a whole lot. Primary production and how much carbon we're going to produce is going to depend on a lot of different things. Now, we've talked about how it's going to be specific organisms, but those specific organisms are going to want specific things. So availability of what we call essential inorganic nutrients is going to be important. So nitrogen and phosphorus are the big two that are going to cycle. Water temperature is going to matter. So remember, we always show that graph that shows mesophiles versus thermophiles, right? Every organism likes a different temperature. Turbidity is going to be huge for primary production because that's going to determine how much or how deep that photic zone is. If it's really, really shallow, that might be an issue. But if it's deeper, we're going to get more primary production because there's more that can fit basically in there in terms of microorganisms. And then this other factor is going to be the degree of vertical mixing. So if you remember maybe from thermodynamics, maybe from chemistry, it kind of depends on where you saw this before. But if you think about convective heating, right? Convection is when we have heating cycles that move up and down in liquids. There's going to be heat cycling within water, but there's also going to be mixing that goes up and down, right? If you think about a water column, it doesn't just stay there, right? It's not like the earth environment. Water mixes and moves. You have organisms moving around. So the amount of degree of heat transfer and vertical mixing up and down is going to have an impact on how much of this primary production can really occur. So that's important to know. So this is going to give you a snapshot of kind of what's going on in the entire environment. So not just primary production, but other things as well. So I'm going to grab my laser pointer to help us out here. So primary production is normally going to happen up in this top area, right? So we've got CO2 from the atmosphere, and autotrophs like to take CO2 from the atmosphere and use it to produce carbon. So they do photosynthesis or they do some other type of production of carbon, right? So photoautotrophs are going to be the big guys that matter in here. So there's things like phytoplankton in here. There's diatoms, which is a type of algae. There's zooplankton. There's bacteria. There's all sorts of stuff that is here in this photic zone, right? And what they're going to do is they're going to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and they're going to produce carbon, right? And when I say produce carbon, they're producing biomass. They're growing, right? Because other organisms are going to prey on them. Right, so they in themselves are a source of carbon to other organisms who will prey on them. Then they'll also produce sugars, right? If you think about photosynthesis, we produce glucose as a byproduct. So that's important too. So we're producing carbon in multiple different ways. We produce the simple sugars and the polysaccharides and all that good stuff, but we're also producing cell mass because remember that organisms are going to eat each other. So that's what's kind of happening in this photic zone. That's primary production, right? And then other things are happening. There's changes in DOC, which is dissolved organic carbon. And then there's all sorts of stuff that happens like physical transport between the two zones. And we start to get down into this bottom zone where we have heterotrophs. And the heterotrophs are going to do the secondary production. So they're going to take the carbon sources from this top layer that sink down into this layer or that move down into this layer, and they are going to use it to produce what they need to produce in order to survive. And that's secondary production. So let's walk through that in a couple more details on the next slide so that we can really cement these concepts. So open oceans actually have very little primary productions because they don't have a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. So the ocean isn't as much of a source of primary production as you think it is. There are exceptions, right? There's areas where we have currents that upwell that bring nutrients from deep in the sea up to the surface, but nitrogen and phosphorus are actually limiting in the ocean, which is why we don't see as much primary production as we would think we would, right? It's only 50% of the world's primary production, but it's like 96% of the water, right? So that is important, because what that then tells us is that it has to be done somewhere else. Primary production has to be happening somewhere else. So coastal areas tend to be the most productive because there's a ton of dissolved and particulate matter that's coming in from rivers and streams and lakes. And a lot of that runoff from terrestrial environment is very, very nutrient rich. And as a result, we see a huge spike in biodiversity in these coastal areas, and that's where we get a huge amount of our primary production. There's one note here on the slide that human activities can actually significantly increase nutrient loading, and that's going to be really important when we talk about what happens with eutrophication with lakes, as we've kind of talked about before. But what you're also going to see on this slide, and I kind of like this photo over here, is this is a little bit old one, but this is net primary production, and as the color goes towards red, it's higher. So you'll see we've got these huge areas of primary production exactly where you'd think it'd be, just south of the equator, in these very tropical areas and areas that have a lot of the nutrients that we naturally need for primary production. So you're actually not seeing a whole lot of it up in that northern hemisphere. When we are doing primary production, chemoautotrophs are going to be in throughout the water column, so they are actually going to be part of primary production too. Photoautotrophs matter quite a bit, but chemoautotrophs can pull CO2 that's dissolved in water out of the water column as well. So when we have oxygen areas that are very, very low, we tend to see a lot of chemoautotrophs. And one thing that we start to care about quite a bit is what we call the formation of dead zones. So dead zones are areas that are expected to kind of increase they're areas of low oxygen, or what we call anoxic areas. And we're expecting to see a lot of these dead zones increase with global climate change. And basically, what a dead zone is it's an area where the oxygen is really, really low. And we'll go through how a dead zone forms on the next slide. But one of the reasons that we're seeing this happen so much from a climate change perspective is that we have warmer temperatures. And when we have warmer temperatures, it causes water stratification to change, like where the layers of water are. So that changes up who can live where. And then more precipitation events are causing more fertilizers to go into aquatic systems. And that starts to matter quite a bit as well, because we have different nutrients. So let's talk about how a dead zone forms. So most of the time we're over here on the left side of the screen, where we have living organisms, we might have salt water, we have dissolved oxygen, we've got heat, fresh river water, we're all good. That's pretty great, right? No problem there. But one of the things that we're starting to see, and this has happened in the Gulf of Mexico, is that we get a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus release from fertilizers and sewage, and it comes down the pipeline, right? It comes down the rivers, it comes down the streams, and it causes those algal blooms that we've talked about before, right? And as it causes those algal blooms, we lose some of the oxygen in the system because the algae are consuming the oxygen. We get algae that die and that start to sink into the area and decompose, and a lot of that oxygen is used up. And then because we can't resupply on oxygen, the deeper water down here starts to become a dead zone because we can't resupply this oxygen. And so what we're seeing is a lot of dead material and detritus happening here, and that's kind of one of the big problems here. And what you'll notice about some of the notes for this dead zone formation here on the very bottom is that this can actually be seasonal. And that's okay, not a big deal, right, in terms of seasonality. But one of the big issues that we have with climate change is that this is accelerating over time. So now let's talk about secondary production. So secondary production basically helps us create an aquatic food web where we're consuming dissolved organic matter rather rapidly. So DOM is dissolved organic matter. So what will start to happen is nutrients, carbon, and energy can be retained in the sunlit surface areas to kind of support growth if we need to. But secondary producers can live in a photic zone or an aphotic zone. And the secondary producers can help cycle nutrients within that photic zone. So they can live in the same exact zone as the primary producers. And things like bacterioplankton will help to remineralize a portion of that dissolved organic matter into CO2 and nutrients, and that fuels more primary production. So we're basically creating a loop where the secondary producers are consuming what comes out of primary producers, but also producing byproducts that allow the primary producers to keep moving. So things like bacterial plankton can assimilate a lot of that dissolved organic matter to produce new biomass of their own, and producing that new biomass is what we call secondary production. So actually building the organisms is the secondary production when we're talking about those heterotrophs in the system. So secondary production is really kind of related to how the food web works, right? So in a real aquatic food web, the heterotrophs like bacterioplankton, zooplankton are going to consume each other, dissolved organic matter, particulate organic matter, and autotrophs. So they're going to keep consuming each other. And then the zooplankton themselves are consumed by larger organisms like fish, other filter feeders. And so what will happen is that it actually takes about 5 food web layers to get up to fish. There's so many microorganisms that are consuming each other, as part of primary production, that it takes quite a while. But what we actually start to see in coastal areas where we have more primary production is that it only takes about 1.5 or 3.5 steps to get to fish, because the primary production levels are higher. So secondary production, is going to be all about producing that biomass, but there's lots of organisms and lots of steps of predation that are going to be involved in how that carbon is cycled. So that's a quick little primary on primary production and secondary production. We'll talk more in depth in class about how this relates to specific habitats.